So many cars, yet so few plugs. Welcome to the Urban EV Podcast, where we speak to industry leaders and EV owners with boots on the ground to read the tea leaves on the direction of the green energy revolution. I'm your host, Rob Hoffman.
And I'm Scott Murphy.
We are joined today by Grid Connections podcast host Chase Drum. In case the show is not yet on your radar, it should be. Since 2020, Grid Connections has explored the evolving intersection of the electrical grid, mobility, and emerging digital technologies. With a background in energy and infrastructure, Chase has built a reputation as an EV evangelist and thought leader in grid modernization. Chase, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Rob. I feel like I need you to introduce me to everything I do now. That was great. Thank you so much.
I'm good at that. That's what I do here. The introduction. Let's see if I can follow this up with a good podcast now. So why don't you tell us a little about your journey into EV advocacy and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, I mean, long story short, this was what was so crazy was I realized I've been building and kind of messing around with electric vehicles now for over 20 years, which I'm not that old. To me, it's just wild to think that how far it's come. And I talk with a lot of people in the industry about this where when I first started, electric vehicles were kind of more like somebody's home brew, like you would with a beer, or some weird science experiment in people's garages where they converted cars into electric. And so now to see them so mainstream and present, and people even actually knowing what an electric vehicle is and not thinking maybe it's a hybrid or like a Segway or something is always kind of good to remember and a kind of thing to have as a good baseline when maybe you're hearing headlines about this, that, or the other. I mean, in such a short time, it's wild to see how far the technology has really come. And I guess to give more context, so yeah, back in high school is really how I originally got started with this. I was building and racing in something, I believe it's still around today. It's called Electrathon America, not Electrify America. I'm sure we might be talking about them, but for a whole different reason.
Probably. But, we always end up there. All roads lead to Electrify America.
Yeah, unfortunately. But essentially, it's a really cool engineering / kind of shop program where myself and others learned how to kind of build these electric vehicles. I mean, sure, they only had like 3.5 horsepower, but they were fully electric. Must have been 4 essentially car batteries in together to, I think it was a 48 volt system to power this little 3.5 horsepower motor for about like an hour. Which back then was this kind of wild
Was
thing.
it all about the endurance at that point? You're using lead acid batteries, obviously.
Yes, that does play into it. But I think when you're at that age and you're building an electric vehicle, I think the craftsmanship usually plays a bigger role, or the fact that you're just trying to drive around these things with a bunch of other kids who just got their driver's license too. So in theory, yes. It was about trying to make the gear ratios and how to do the right thing to really get that battery to go as far and as long as you want. But in reality, 9 times out of 10, the thing usually either broke for whatever reason because it was made by a bunch of high schoolers, or some other high schooler accidentally drove into yours, causing it to wreck.
Was this like a go-kart? Like, what did this thing look like?
No, actually, it's bigger than a go-kart. They're usually 3-wheel, kind of like when you think of those like traditional kind of weird-looking electric vehicles, they would be 3 wheels, and the motor was powering the back rear motor. And most of the time, you're just using actually bike tires and all this stuff because they're so small and light. But it teaches you all sorts of crazy and wild, different kind of concepts I think more kids should be learning today anyways in shop class, and just kind of a lot of these kind of more hands-on learning. So that's how I got involved with this. And then at the same time, that was in 2003. Back then, I came across, using that old Google thing, I came across this company called Tesla, and I was like, wow, that's really interesting. They're going to take these Lotus Elises.
Because reminder to everyone, there was a time where Elon Musk was not a part of Tesla.
And I do want to caveat, I know he's a very political figure. I've been really fortunate in my own professional career to work with people who were actually at Tesla in those early days, and they'll pretty much tell you, like, Tesla wouldn't be around if it wasn't for him, good or bad.
Yeah, no doubt about it.
I don't even know, maybe they had just started selling the Roadster already. Anyway, I was like, oh, that's really fascinating. There's someone actually not just making little versions of this that you could buy. Sure, it's $150,000, but it's like sexy looking and it's fast. And it's like, oh, that's really cool. Maybe there's like an industry there. So I had been like following and just kind of paying attention to this. And I think the first time I ever actually had the chance to drive the OG Tesla Roadster was like in 2009.
Wow.
I happen to be in the Bay Area, and I was just like, I was there for actually I was working in the solar industry at that time. And I was like, you know what? I'll walk into one of these dealerships and check this thing out. I was like, wow, these things are actually real. There's one right in front of me. They're pretty sexy. And the sales guy, who probably at that time wasn't much older than I was, he's like, you want to take it for a test drive? And of course, there was no way in hell I could afford this thing. And I, for some reason, said I just couldn't help it. I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And then I was just bombing around this thing in Palo Alto. I was like, oh my god, these things are like real things. You can actually, who knows if this company's ever going to make it? Hope they do. But like, this makes sense now. Like this is how you would do it. You make them sexy, make them approachable. Because back then it was just like golf carts and whatever that people, when they think of electric vehicles, and I think probably still some people do.
And the failed GM EV1, right? Back in those days, that was still resonating. How GM killed the electric car.
God, when did that movie come out? Who killed the electric car? Because now there's been like sequels to it. I think the original probably came out like '05 or something. So yeah, I had probably just seen that too. I'm like, oh, okay, let's see if this little car company, or at least someone will take this technology and run with it. Well, we know the history of how that ran it and turned out. But yeah, you're totally right. Speaking of like the EV1, the OG also of kind of electric vehicles. And I think that's why I was so surprised to see like, wow, not only is this thing sexy and works, but it's like, this is how you do it. This is how you have to sell them. Because while the EV1 was really impressive in its own way, it just wasn't really that. Obviously, there was the own internal workings of GM going against it. But even then, it just would have been like, and there's obviously a market for a commuter car just doing 150 miles. But yeah, and so like at that point I was like, okay, there's a business here when I'd driven that car, but I was still kind of working in the solar industry. So I decided to say, I'll kind of pay attention to this. And then, yeah, because it was before the Model S came out. I even worked as a contractor for Tesla for like 6 months. And that was kind of a cool opportunity to kind of see a little bit more behind the curtain. But even back then, I mean, it was really, I got to say, they were doing a lot of things right. But at the same time, like total startup culture. And to even people I still know that work there, there's still a lot of that. Obviously, they've gotten a lot bigger, but it's just like everyone has a part in it. Everyone wears a hat. And sometimes when you go into work that day, you're wearing a hat you've never worn before. Or it forces resourcefulness and people to get to work together and really create some cool things. But after that, I was like, okay, yeah, now this is getting to a scale. And then it was kind of like in 2014, 2015, I started working for some EV startups. So even more or less an autonomy startup at that time. And it was just kind of this, between my own personal interest and then kind of just professional crash course sometimes, maybe a bad pun, but worked with electric vehicles as they evolved, and then started working with electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I mean, the other crazy thing to think about is, like I said, these used to be in people's garages. And back then, most people just charged on a level 1 or just a little wall outlet. And so Tesla is like, oh, look, we have this sexy home charging level 2 thing. So it kind of makes it quasi easy-ish, assuming the electrician who installs it, to charge kind of fast at home. And like, wow, that's practical. I mean, if you own a house and you have 2 cars, well, I don't know why one at least wouldn't be electric. And then fast forward again, I think it was 2013 is when the original Tesla supercharger was announced. And you're like, wow, this whole DC fast charging thing, that's crazy. And then I at least went to the first one built in Oregon, because that's where I live. I live in Oregon. And there was one in, of all places, Wilsonville, which is a random kind of little town to have one, but it's on I-5. So obviously the idea was these things would grow and become more of them. And once again, you're like, wow, this is really cool. I'm not sure if this is going to be the company to do it, but there's like an actual way to make these things instead of a second car. I think there's a future to be like your only or primary car. And obviously that's also evolved. And I think what you do here, Rob, is so great and kind of shows, yeah, it can be your primary car and how that works into people's lives. So fast forward now, here we are. I started my own consulting business focused on kind of electric vehicle electrification. And now you're seeing electric vehicles, not just Tesla, but all sorts and all pretty much everywhere I go now. Whereas I remember, God, even not that long ago, but when the Model S came out, I'd be like, wow, I saw a Model S today on the road. That's crazy.
I remember that.
It'd be like
I remember those days.
And then I see another one, like, wow, that's wild. And then it was kind of the same thing for the Model 3. And now it's just like...
almost half the taxis in Valencia are Teslas now.
Yeah, which is awesome. And then I went for kind of a drive through very rural parts of Oregon and actually even Southeast Washington yesterday. And as I'm getting onto this kind of random highway, there's a Ford Lightning that's pulling out. It says Vestas because it's in the middle of nowhere, but there's a bunch of windmills and stuff. And so it's just kind of cool to see, wow, I mean, these things work. These things have come so far. And obviously, I think a lot of people who listen to this and say, this, oh my God, things aren't happening fast enough. Well, there's some truth to that, but I'm consistently reminded about just where things have come. And I've always been a fan of history. And so you look at how long it took for all these different transportation technologies just to go from really in some ways like horse to steam engines and steam engines to cars. And that took a couple decades. You really go down rabbit hole. It used to be when you got a diesel car back in like the 50s and 60s, that was its own kind of transformation evolution. But when you bought one of those, they would actually give you a map that came with your car showing all of the gas
where to get
stations.
diesel.
So like you really don't have to go that far back to realize all of these things we're dealing with today have actually already been accomplished in a much less sophisticated, but then also in some ways much more logistically and supply chain challenging times. So while there's definitely still room for improvement, it just seems like, yeah, now we're kind of past all of these big hurdles. And that's a big thing my consulting group does is we work with companies to for fleet electrification to even a lot of like counties and municipalities and governments to kind of help them figure out how they may want to electrify their fleet or look at putting in EV charging and a lot of different really kind of fun, cool problem solving things that we help a lot of different people with.
Yeah, it's funny. You just reminded me of, speaking of diesel, one of the first cars my dad bought me when I got my driver's license was a 1980 Volkswagen Rabbit diesel.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
God. God, why?
That could literally do 65 miles an hour on the highway with a tailwind. You needed that to keep that pace going. There could not be a grade going up either. Otherwise, you're kind of,
I was going to say,
get down to 40.
Uphill?
Yeah, no, on the highway with a steep grade, 40 miles an hour. I kid you not. It was the most underpowered vehicle on the road in the history of cars. But it got 50 miles to the gallon, which was good because it seemed like the fuel gauge was broken because it never moved. But you learned very quickly, much like in the EV world today, you knew where the stations that had diesel were located. And by the time you got down to a quarter of a tank, even if it took you a month to get there, you knew that it was time to fill up because you didn't want to kind of get caught with your pants down. So I guess maybe I was I'm a pioneer in the sense of kind of scraping by looking for places to fuel up. And so I'm just kind of used to it. It's innate for me. But here we are today, and there's certainly a lot of parallels. So on that note, let's talk about the grid in particular. Grid connections. This is all about the grid. This is certainly your area of expertise. So why don't you just talk to us about the state of where we are today and where we need to be for this sort of EV revolution to truly take hold?
Okay, that could be its own podcast series, actually. The grid itself is EVs are, especially with all these things now going on with like AI and the amount of power those data centers consume. The grid was built in the kind of more or less late 1800s, but expanded as the U.S. expanded. So it really expanded east to west. And there's obviously been a lot of big things along the way around with like hydroelectric power in some areas where how the transmission lines and all these different connecting tissue and technology has evolved. I mean, it always kind of reminds me of like the human body. And when you kind of look at like veins and arteries and how they flow, there's still a lot of challenges. And you look at like a country like China where they just put all this stuff in, like, so it seems like overnight, and sometimes it has been, but they have the advantage, and you've seen this with certain technologies where like they build these cities more or less out of nothing. So they don't have a lot of the legacy hardware or some of this other infrastructure challenges that we run into when you start looking, especially at like these DC fast charging situations to really build out and grow the EV charging infrastructure. But at the same time, it's still amazingly resilient. And I think that's also what's so cool about really how you can put an electric vehicle in your life. Because especially if you, I think this is why it's so important to have an EV that's efficient. But I mean, that's why you can use like a level one. And I actually, with the rental we've been have lately, we drive our EVs a lot, kind of being in a more rural area. Level one works it's even kind of blown my mind as someone who's kind of playing around with that stuff. Just plugging into the same outlet my electric toothbrush goes into powers my car, and it really hasn't been an issue, which I really was even surprised by. Because we drive our like even our Model Y, we were driving that about 30,000 miles a year, that alone.
Wow.
And now that we have
miles.
this other car, we're driving on that one a lot too. And so I guess to take a step back, but go into the grids, we're seeing just such an amazing evolution with not only, well, there's two things. I mean, one, there's the hardware layer that we kind of have, the existing one, and now we're seeing kind of the software revolution, how that's playing into like kind of manipulating and taking advantage of like, well, we have what we have, but we can actually be really resilient with it if we're smart. And then we also just have the experience that with electric vehicle, yeah, you can at least use the existing outlet, or you can start, if you have a dryer or something in your garage, then you could maybe even upgrade to that. But I mean, a lot of like the home charging side stuff is really basic, pretty straightforward home electrical. There's nothing really crazy and wild about that. And so that really checks the box for like 80+% of EV charging right there. And it's kind of boring and doesn't get the headlines, of course. Whereas DC fast charging, that can be where a bit more of the drama is. And obviously, when you're on a road trip, you really do need it to work. And I really think within the last, I would say 24 months, but especially like 18 and more recently, it has really started to step up and turn around with obviously Tesla just doing their own thing and going crazy with their superchargers. But you're starting to see more public DC fast chargers start to be more resilient. And some of that too is these people in the industry, a lot of them coming from Tesla, but a lot of them are kind of finding out their own hacks and ways to speed up the installation. Obviously, there are a couple things that are kind of like for certain. One's like how they say about like death and taxes. There's also like getting past the utility to get your transformer and all that stuff in just takes forever. So hopefully that will change, but just given like just that industry and things, that's still probably the slowest part. Once you have that, the permits and everything else kind of moves pretty fast. But once again, people are kind of figuring out, and I don't want to badmouth utilities. A lot of them are also starting to realize, okay, this is as crazy as it is, it's like a really big different thing for them. Even though from their side, they essentially see a Walmart. They don't really see anything that different, but they're used to working at that kind of speed or kind of just being like, okay, this Walmart's going in, so we're putting this transformer, boom. But now they're starting to be leveraging that skill set and that knowledge base, and then also kind of leveraging how they can even play software into that to really manage that.
You know, I think the big thing here with utilities is this sort of decentralized grid that I think maybe they see the value in this as well. Now, obviously, there's level 3 and putting in the transformers, and that's one thing. But on a more sort of granular level here, V the G or V the X or whatever you want to call it. Why don't you talk to us a little more about, its potential for kind of stabilizing, the energy delivery and what that means to EVs in general?
I think what's really fascinating is if we look at like a large scale, probably there are like school buses that are electric, and there's been pilot programs where that's actually been fairly successful, where you have these electric school buses, especially in the summer, like in a large city, where since most schools are out for summer, they can have them kind of sitting there, and then they have pretty large batteries usually in them. So you get a bunch of those together in one spot, and you do start having a pretty powerful way to back up and do some really cool grid management, especially in the summer when it's hot and people start turning on their AC units and all this stuff. And that might be also just a fun kind of history side note. I've talked to a couple of people in the industry a while ago, and ones who have been in there for decades, and they're like, so what do you think of electric vehicles and all this going on? They're like, oh, we'll solve this. This really isn't that crazy. What was crazy was the invention of air conditioning units for like in New York City. And now you have all these people putting those in, and that just like completely challenged the grid like nothing else we'd ever seen before, because of the time and all this stuff that would turn on. And we just didn't have the technology back then. And we were able to figure that out. So a lot of people in the industry realize there's going to be some lifting and work, but especially most utilities, they're not too worried about it. And they do see that opportunity. Vehicle to grid, I think maybe I'm actually more bearish about it. I think it's a really cool concept and idea. And I think something we'll figure out, but I think there's still a lot of hurdles and you need kind of standardization. I think Hyundai and Ford have their own way of doing it. And then you have Tesla kind of now does it with the Cybertruck, but they have their own way of doing it. The way Tesla actually did it's really smart, I think, personally. And to be honest with you, where I think, especially kind of living in a more rural area, what is more realistic and cost effective, I think longer term, it's still a little expensive, would be for like residential home backup for those who would normally have like a generator. Having your EV as part of that solution makes, I think, a lot of financial sense. But this is the big caveat. Well, there's two parts. One, if you have an older home and you haven't gone through a panel upgrade or you haven't installed solar or any of those things, you're probably gonna have to deal with that cost. And that can be anywhere from like 6 to 10 grand, which is unfortunate. But that's just a reality of life. And to be fair, you sometimes actually have to do that anyway if you're gonna put in like a gas generator, oil generator house. So it's like not just an EV energy backup issue. But like, for example, probably the biggest to position it early on when they brought it to market was Ford with the F-150 Lightning. And now GM kind of offers something through their GM Energy thing. But they offered Ford Home Charge or Charge Pro. I forget the exact name of it. But one of the interesting things is how that was implemented. Not only would you maybe have to do the panel upgrade, but all the infrastructure and all that stuff just became kind of more and more expensive. And kind of... from what I've heard, they've kind of simplified it a bit, but it's a bit of a challenging install. So you had labor cost, you had electrician had to make sure they did things right, and there were just a couple issues with it at launch. Tesla kind of thought about this. Essentially what they've done is instead of trying to put it behind the meter and all, like requiring a lot more complex work, in the case of the Cybertruck, if you ever want to use it then as a home backup, you actually need a lot less hardware, and the communication between the two is a lot simpler because it's using a part that's already part of the motor to do the inverting of the energy back and forth and actually making the integration pretty much seamless. And I know that I think that's what Rivian, I believe, is doing for, they've said their upcoming R2 is going to be a home grid or Vita G, Vita House capable.
Yeah, and I think right now Vita X, Vita vehicle to everything, I think now is going to be the winner on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's a branding, there's a marketing, there's a standards. There's a lot of issues still with this. That's why I'm a little more bearish. And there's been people who've been already talking about like promoting this for like 5+ years. Like I said, I think there'll be a point for it, but I don't think it's going to be the most mainstream thing. But anyway, you're starting to see other automakers kind of realize, okay, that you technically have a slight more upfront cost when buying the vehicle. But I think what's really cool is it unlocks so much more potential for if you want to do this, that I'm hoping more and more automakers will go this way. And like I said, Rivian's doing it with their next generation of vehicles.
As you mentioned, you're bearish on this. I've always been pretty bullish. Now, this is kind of really more your forte. So I'm really curious if there's a way to truly monetize this, and I believe there is with energy management systems, that you're sort of feeding your stuff back into the grid, whether or not it's truly a power backup for yourself. And once a standard is developed, like you said, Tesla's the superior one right now. Go figure.
Well, and just to clarify, not to get, like I said, in the weeds, It's not even like that they're superior. It's just and it's not like it's any sort of patent pending thing. They just implement it really like they usually do, very smartly. So I think we will see. I don't smartly, not the right word, but they implemented it very well. And
in a very intelligent manner.
Yes.
I believe I see the future on this. You're truly an EV and energy grid consultant. So there is an angle here, for me as a pundit, sure, I'm taking the bird's eye view of everything and I consider myself a futurist. But at the same time, I love hearing the take of people with boots on the ground, people who are really, truly right there in the mud, getting dirty and seeing how these things are truly implemented. Certain things work in theory, and I hear you're saying, all right, well, if you have an older home, it's going to cost you $10K to upgrade your house. Well, 9 out of 10, 99 out of 100 aren't going to do that.
I mean, I also think we just have to get past EV adoption as a general thing. I think trying to force this Vita X stuff right now, it's like, guys, just take a chill pill and get people to buy EVs in the first place. Okay, cool. It's cool that you can run your maybe brand new house that you just bought that has a switchover panel on it already. But people don't even install natural gas generators that often right now, unless you live in the South where it's, hurricane prone or you have an unstable, grid. Texas.
I'll actually defend Texas for this. So this is what's really funny is a lot of people like to, and obviously there's been some public issues that ERCOT or the Texas grid has had, but that's actually where usually the most cutting edge stuff is happening. So
because it's a closed system, they can kind of do whatever they want for sure. But no one.
Well, it's not that it's a closed system. It's like it is that Texas kind of Wild West mentality that when trying to deal with the other ones, and so actually a lot of I think the coolest. And don't get me wrong, I agree with the sentiment of what you're saying, but I think this might be something that I have this conversation with a lot of people, and even journalists sometimes. It blows their mind because I think they want to just see the headlines and kind of just poo-poo ERCOT and all this stuff. But it's actually, that's where some of the coolest stuff is happening right now with grid stuff, because you can kind of like, well, dealing with others, we'd have to have all sorts of issues and approvals, yada yada. Well, here there's more of kind of like capitalism goes good or bad, but it allows you to do some really cool testing. So between like some of the stuff around renewable energy, some of the stuff around how to do these VDEX like pilots and stuff, that's actually where some of the stuff's taking off first.
Well, and again, I think that's very much like Tesla, right? You know, it's again.
I mean, there's a big reason they have a presence there now. Yeah.
Yeah, well, but it's a closed system, so it's very easy when you don't have to get the buy-in of other constituents or other stakeholders to make those kinds of choices. But ultimately, in the end, you know, not to get into the politics of ERCOT, because that's, again, to your point, a whole other podcast episode, or maybe a series in and of itself. But yeah, of course they can do innovative things because they don't have to ask permission from anybody else.
And I'm excited to see that, because I think that's where traditionally I've been so bearish, if I'm being honest, with the whole vehicle to grid thing, was because in my experience, for a long time, it was a bunch of wonks talking about, like, policy wonks. So like, oh, this will be great. We'll do this, this, and this. And we can, like, do it today. I was like, well, and this would go back a few years. There weren't any vehicle to grid cars of any, like, large number. And so I'm just like, okay, let's not get ahead of ourselves. And I think, Scott, to your point, exactly. Let's just get electric vehicles on the road first, before we start putting too many carts in front of the horse, whatever metaphor you name it you want to use. And so I am bullish long-term, bearish short-term. And you're right. There's pros and cons to the closed loop thing. When you start, like, I mean, we even saw this with the roll on the implementation of the supercharger network, worked great for Teslas, and then more and more of these non-Tesla EVs start using it, and they're like, okay, there's some backwards compatibility things we have to figure out. To their credit,
a lot, actually. Yeah, we could dive into that. That's a left turn, but you know, it's interesting that you're mentioning that now. Me as a Kia driver, this is something here where, you know, from everyone who just bird's eye view heard the headlines. Oh, next, that's the standard. All right, everyone's getting them built into their cars. That's the you know, everyone's going to be compatible with NACS. You can charge on the Tesla supercharger network. There's a few massive issues depending on the brand of car that you drive, of pulling into those stations. If you own a GM, do you know what the problems are with pulling into with a GM vehicle into a Tesla supercharger station?
Their voltage is too low. Yeah, right.
It's not a voltage issue for the GMs because they're 400 volt architecture like the Teslas. It's the charging port door access is on the wrong side.
What's the issue with the Equinox? Because is it an amperage issue? I thought it was because their voltage is like at 3. I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't. They're kind of in the inverse issue from what I understand, because their voltage, even though they're 400 volt, they're like 300. They're super low. So they have the inverse issue that they run into, kind of being out like that peak kind of chunk of energy that Tesla usually has. I'm going to do a whole thing. This was my whole issue when people are like Porsche, like, oh, Porsche's come out with 800 volt charging. Charging is solved. Tesla's going away. It's like all this crap where it's like marketing versus like real world. I do think a lot of tech's going to go 800 volt eventually or closer to it. But even Porsche's vehicles, not all of the Macan, awesome EV. That has 800 volt technology. Actually, it doesn't. It's in the 600 volt range.
600s, right?
Not to be a total nerd about it, but it's like this whole, and that's where sometimes I struggle with some of the vehicle to grid stuff. Is like I think it will take off, but the messaging, and it's a real, like, using the crawl, walk, run philosophy. It might be run or sprinting or like doing a marathon, and we are still baby crawl. Like, maybe now some people are like the toddler who's like just like starting to stand. So like I love all these ideas, and I think the technology will get there. But it's one of those things where it's just like let's kind of go, like Scott said perfectly. Let's just get the EVs out there. And even to this point, like you're talking about with just the charge port and going from the CCS to the North American Charging Standard. I mean, my 2 cents was I'm kind of glad it went to the NACS standard, just because now you can just tell people, you plug this in, your car starts charging. Instead of like, well, you need a J1772 instead of a CCS1, or in Europe, then you have a CCS2, yada, yada, yada. It's like people start glazing over like so quickly. So having one thing that just charges the car solves a lot of this. And this is kind of the crusade that a good friend of mine, Matt Teskey, who's been on my podcast a bunch, and the CEO.
We've had it. Yeah, we've hosted him as well.
Good.
Yeah, he's great.
He's great. He's a character. But it's the kind of this whole electric fueling concept, and people like, we're nerds about this. We can talk about this and go, well, this is good, this is bad, yada, yada, yada. Most people are just like, I need a car to get from point A to point B to take my kids to school, yada, yada, yada. Like, totally fair, valid things. And if that doesn't work for you, then it's not going to take off.
No, I mean, just on that point, like to Matt's business, we had him on, and I think what he's doing is really smart. But for example, I introduced him to a couple of venture capital firms because I know he's in the process of raising, and those guys just didn't get it.
Yeah.
You know, they came back and said, we don't, why do we need this? And I think about, you know, we were talking about diesel earlier, and when they were trying to figure out how to prevent people from putting diesel fuel into their petrol cars, right? So they just made the fueling pipe a little fatter on the diesel so that you couldn't plug it in. You know, I think we've got to get to that point with EVs. It's got to be completely mindless. And like part of what we're doing here at Clover, which is my startup, is trying to create that simplicity on a much different scale. Obviously, we're two-wheeled electric mobility, but I think that level of simplicity has got to come to EV cars in order for there to be widespread adoption. And I think if you have to sit here and say, oh, I have CHAdeMO or CCS or I don't, who even cares what any of that means? I just want to plug in my car, sit there for 20 minutes listening to a podcast, and then leave with enough energy to do the shit that I have to do. Like, you know, and there's all these conversations about, oh, what should electric charging stations look like? DC fast chargers? Should they have, you know, convenience stores and coffee shops? And it's like, nobody went to the gas station thinking like, oh, I'm going to get great food at the gas station convenience store. It was just, I got there.
Although I'm going to disagree with you here, Scott. There is a sort of those amenities. I can tell you right now,
well, I'm
really
saying we
sweeten
should have
the experience.
Yeah,
it's a much better hanging out in the convenience store and getting some goods and, feeling like some coffee and donuts than hanging out in the back of a Walmart parking lot. At least you have the Walmart there. So sometimes there's not even that.
Yeah.
No, I'm agreeing with you completely on that one. But I think like you have to think about charging and fueling an EV in a totally different way than you ever have about cars in the past, right? You don't get gas at your house. Like we talked about this on the last podcast. You know, you don't get gas at a hotel. A hotelier now has to think about, I have to be at an EV charging point because I have customers that are coming here looking for electric fuel, which I think is a great way of putting it. But I think you can't think of fueling an EV in the same way that you think of fueling a standard internal combustion engine. I don't want Rob to get yelled at for bad acronyms.
You, Scott.
But you have to totally shift everybody's thinking about fueling, period. Because like to what we've been speaking about earlier, forget about vehicle to X or whatever. You're going to probably charge your car at home if you live in a suburban environment. Or if you're somebody like Rob, you're going to need access to DC fast charging because you live in a densely populated urban area. Like this isn't just building a new gas station for EVs. This is rethinking your entire vehicle uptime, you know, equation. And I think that's, as soon as we simplify that and get past all this nerdy bullshit that no one actually cares about, then this becomes wide adoption. And then I think forget about, and Chase, I'm sure we could nerd out on this for hours, whether the grid has the capacity to do what we want to do.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, beautifully said. And once again, this could be a podcast series, is imagine trying to go to a dealership and asking about vehicle to grid, let alone like, how do you charge this thing at home? And so there's like so many of these things where it's just like, let's just get this. There's a lot of cool stuff we can do. And there's a lot of the people in the industry where you just have to kind of sit them down, like hold them and just like, okay, we just have to focus on the next 3 years. We'll talk about the next 3 years from now. Okay, let's just get this part and then we'll go from there. Because don't get me wrong, I can go on just I'm also really big into aviation. So now I'm seeing all these eVTOL companies starting to take off.
Now
they're talking about charging
among
infrastructure.
The three of us, we're
wait
screwed.
a second, Chase, did we talk about aviation before?
We can't talk about
I don't
aviation.
think so.
We can't talk about aviation. You got Rob's a pilot.
My ears are perking right now.
Really? I didn't know that.
No, we're all
I'm a private pilot.
Yeah.
Does anybody on here do CrossFit? We can't talk about CrossFit either.
No.
I'm not CrossFit guy.
I probably should.
No, I'm just saying you can't get pilots to stop talking about flying, and you can't get CrossFit people to stop talking about CrossFit.
Okay, fine. I'm like, there's something you know that I don't, but
no.
I get what Scott's saying, and that's very true.
Yeah, you get aviation nerds going, forget it.
And it's really funny to me, eVTOLs and all that stuff to their own thing is I think there's some cool stuff there, but I think it's kind of still a small I don't want to say niche, but like use cases. And at least in the short term, and I'm going to say short term, being like
for now,
20 to 30 years short term. Yeah. But now there's these companies that are like, well, what charging standard should we use? And then there's like, well, we could use CCS1. We could use this. Like, why are we doing this again? Literally, why don't you just, they're talking about putting these things on that, like some of these landing pads on the top of car garages. And I'm like, Why not just use the charging, like one charging stand we're already using for the cars that can put way more power than the batteries in this little helicopter thing could ever use? It's that kind of like messaging and like let's not overcomplicate this. The answer already exists. Let's just get the answer out there.
There's an analogy here, Chase. I think it's what you've been hammering now this entire podcast is, it doesn't matter whether it's the right or wrong standard. I think you just need the standard. And I think that's a really important part of moving things forward because it simplifies everything. A reminder to everyone who is my age or older. Chase, do you remember the whole VHS versus Betamax battles of the 80s? Probably.
I'm aware of them. I was not a participant in those battles very closely. I benefited from them, I'll say that, but yeah.
So there was the two standards, and to be honest with you, the Betamax Sony's product was superior, but the problem with the Betamax was it didn't go longer than 2 hours. That was the max capacity of their video cassettes. And people that wanted to record their NFL games last longer. So those are typically 3-hour recordings. And that's probably the reason why the Betamax died. So you had an inferior technology, VHS, which really gave you a real crappy picture. It didn't look nearly as good. The cassette was bigger. But they almost didn't matter in the end. Sure, the best standard didn't win, but there was now a standard that everyone could embrace. Everyone could buy the same VHS players. And now when you went to Blockbuster, anyone remember those? That powerhouse Blockbuster, there was one on every street corner. You didn't have to worry about what size box this was. Did I bring home the wrong standard to play at
Actually,
home?
fun fact, where I live, well, we just moved from, but I lived in Bend, Oregon, which had the last Blockbuster tongue twister there, actually, and still there. So, fun fact. So it went from every street corner to now just one.
To one street corner.
Yeah.
Is it still there?
Awesome.
I thought they were done. I know there's like one in Alaska,
left.
One in Bend.
It's still there. Yeah, it's more a tourist gimmick than anything. But I've been in it, of course, and
it's a selfie location.
Kind of. And they still do rent actual movies and stuff. But it's more. I don't want to poo-poo on it. But it is kind of. Yeah, I think anyone's going there is kind of doing it for fun versus the practicality of just hopping on Netflix and throwing something on.
Okay, so right. Rob, what do you think? Should we move into our rapid fire round?
Rapid fire it is. Let's do it.
Okay, so Chase, first car.
Technically, it was a 1997 Ford Explorer. I mean, I joke, but I love that thing, actually. That was such a solid vehicle. And where I grew up, we had a lot of snow, and I'd go skiing, and you throw stud tires on that thing, and it was awesome.
It was a beast.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, if I'd probably kept better, I was like 16 when and it was kind of like the family car, so I would be driving a lot, but it was kind of shared with myself, and later my brother even a little bit. Had we taken even better care of it, which was a pretty low bar for the average 16-year-old in car maintenance, it probably would have lasted longer, but it at least made, I think, 250,000 miles.
Respectable.
Yeah, and then the other family car was a Subaru Outback, and so go figure, that thing lasted until, that's an unfair competition. That's like Tyson versus some junior high school boxing program. Yeah. Or me. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so next question. Yeah, first EV.
Technically, like personally owned, it would be a Model Y. I've actually had a couple of Model S's as like business vehicles that I've had access to for like over a decade. But like personally, my money on the line here, it was a Model Y.
And what are you driving today?
So we still have the Model Y, and then I'm bad. I'm locked in. We got another EV, so I got a Tesla Model 3. And to be honest with you, part of it too was I just love sedans. I'm a car guy, believe it or not, even though I'm EVs. And like sedan wise, and just the tech wise, the new Model 3 is such a solid home run. I was even talking to somebody about this the other day that like people like I'm getting a lot of questions about like what's an EV that's not Tesla. And we all kind of agreed to just like go test drive one, and then I'll give you a list. And don't worry, I like a lot of the keys. There's a lot of great cars, but especially for like the sedan and even the small crossover with the Y. But the sedan, like the new Model 3, is so like I'll be the first to admit the old Model 3s were great cars. There was a lot of cool tech, but they didn't have like sometimes more of the premium feeling of like the traditional Germans ones. But this time around, when I was looking to buy one, I test drove the new 3, and even my wife, I like went to pick up my wife when we were doing the test drive, and she's like, "This car is so relaxing," and I was like, "Yeah, there's just, and for the price, there's just, it's been a big step up." So that was a big reason.
It's funny how the Model Y refresh is getting all the attention, and the 3 just kind of didn't, because Americans in general are just not big fans of sedans.
Yeah, exactly, and yeah, I think that's part of the reason. I mean, we saw this even when the old Y came out. The 3 sales just dropped a huge, because you're totally right. Most Americans want crossovers, but yeah, like now they have like 0% financing right now on the 3 and stuff. So it's like there's a point where I just tell people, like, okay, personal beliefs or whatever aside, like, do you want to spend more and get a worse product, or do you just want, especially for like people in new EVs, and just and most of, like, especially their car guys are like, okay, I'll get it. Because like the closest thing for what that is probably like the 4 Series, and there's pros and cons to that car. To be honest with you, from like the BMW driver's car, I don't think it is one. It's just really heavy, and it's a fine driving car and stuff, but I just think it's too heavy, and personally I don't like the looks of it too. But that's a whole nother. I guess I gotta come clean. 2 years ago, we bought a 1987 Land Rover Defender 90, the 2-door version. Love that thing. And so that's part of the reason, probably also being very outdoorsy and living in really rural areas, that we haven't like gone a Rivian or something, other than the cost too, but among other things. It's just, we have that thing, and that is just so much fun to drive. And it requires some skill. Whereas
you got to be able to turn a wrench to own a car like that. An old Land Rover, you have to. Yeah,
it has been super reliable, I will say. And part of that is just because it has like the Defender versus like the old Range Rovers. The only electrics that thing has is its headlights, the winch, which isn't working, and
of course
the CB radio, which also isn't working. But as long as the lights are working,
CB radio,
it doesn't even have a radio.
Talk about old school.
Yeah, and that was just the way we bought it. Was someone had just at some, and I don't even think, I forget who had installed it, but it's so much fun. It's a right-hand drive that we bought from the woman who brought it over from the UK. 5-speed manual.
That's awesome.
And it is so much fun to drive.
I'm officially jealous.
But we only put like a few thousand miles on that thing at the most. The vast majority is tens of thousands of miles on our EVs.
So speaking of, get back to EVs, do you have any awesome or awesomely bad charging story? Now, you've been mostly a Tesla owner, so maybe this does not apply to you.
This is that. Well, in my defense too, I've been charging EVs for a long time. So back in 2013, this was still before superchargers. So I've had plenty of bad level 2 experiences. But yeah, I mean, I will say, to Tesla's credit, they really have been great at just kind of setting the bar. I think one of the funny things was, not in the moment funny, but a lot of people I know who are not even the biggest like Tesla fans for some understandable reasons, but they work in the charging space. And there was that one in Littleton, I think, Massachusetts, that someone like kind of did some arson thing. And in under 48 hours, you would never have known it was back up and running. And people are just like, it would be hard for gas stations to be that fast at repairing or burn down. And this is why there's still the gold standard for that kind of level of just like knowing what happened, being on it, and responding. But yeah, God, bad. So there's this cool thing, in theory, that was created back in 2012 through 2014 called the West Coast Electric Highway. It was all, a large part of it was through Oregon, but the original vision was really just for it to be I-5. But then Washington, Oregon, California, all of them kind of built it out east more to a lot of the other kind of more rural and tourist areas. And so like back in the day, like, wow, this is crazy. They have these CHAdeMO chargers that charge up to 50 kilowatts. Wow. Which by nowadays is like ancient Greek or something. But that was like such a wild, cool thing to see. Fast forward, I think it was like, maybe it was 2020 or 2019. They're like, we're going to upgrade these. And they upgraded them with CCS1. And they are, I hate them so much. I consistently, and it's so unfortunate because they're in such cool tourist areas and just cool area. Oregon, this will be, I think Oregon gets such a bad rap. Most people just know Portland. And yeah, it rains there a lot. There's no around that. But as a state, we've got oceans, we got mountains, we got desert. you got to get out of, like, when you land in Portland, don't get me wrong, there's some great restaurants and some really cool things still there. But I always tell people, like, okay, go to whatever restaurant you want to go to, and then get in your rental car.
Go
Ideally an
east.
electric.
Yeah, head to Bend.
Yeah,
It's
Bend,
awesome. I've
go to
been
the
there.
coast, and you won't, like, Bend is more like Sedona than it's like Portland. And I think that throws off a lot of people. And so as a state, it's really great. And we have just a lot of great natural amenities and cool things to check out. But these things, I usually use them as an example of what not to do. So whenever I have free time or I'm on like a road trip and I see one, I'll use it. And if it works, the card reader is a pain in the butt. Then you got to download the app. And I hate anything that requires an app. And I'll even call it out technically with some a lot of third-party sites, you have to use them with Tesla, which I don't think is great. They at least have a good app. But even then, I'm still a big believer. I talk about this a lot on our podcast where and this is kind of like Harvard Business Startup Review 101 kind of stuff. For a technology to like disrupt or replace the existing technology, it doesn't have to be as good. It has to be better. Plug and charge. I mean, and that's probably kind of being that Tesla ecosystem. That is better. You just plug in and walk away. And trust me, when I've been on, like, I've done the farthest I've done in an EV road trip in a day is from Bend, Oregon to Phoenix. And I've done that a few times. So that's about 1,200 miles in a day. And there's a lot of times when you're going down the road and you just get out of the car like, I need to find a bathroom immediately. And that kind of goes back to your point that there could be some better charging locations, even with the Tesla stuff, trying to like more amenities and so on. But the plug-in, like, just get out of the car, slam the charger in, and walk away, and it just starts charging is such a better expectation than even having to get your car out for gas. And unfortunately, I think still with a lot of third-party chargers, and some of this, it's not just on the charger. Some of it's obviously even on the EV manufacturer to have plug and charge. There still needs to be room for that. Yeah, these things that unfortunately they replaced on the West Coast Electric Highway there's like so many hoops you have to jump through for a successful experience. And I think all the time, like, my mom would never do this. I'm only a big enough nerd and like pissed off about this that I'm actually doing this to prove a point that these things are terrible. Because I should take that back. I know some people, but they're just as big, if not even bigger, EV car nerds than I am that use these things usually. That are like, oh, see, they work. And it's just like, yeah, but people have lives to live. They don't want to learn how to download your stupid app. They don't want to download and it's just like these things have to work. And I do want to kind of go back to what I was saying earlier. We have definitely seen a big improvement with them working. Just across the board, not obviously these ones, unfortunately, but it also should not stop. If things are getting better, keep going, start speeding up. And I'm hoping we start seeing plug-in charges more of a thing, because I think that is kind of, it gets to the point where it's what people know about electricity. You plug it in and it works. And they don't need to know. They just know there's the outlet, there's the plug. And that's what kind of plug and charge allows for. So that's what I'd love to see more vehicles do.
Yeah, I think plug and charge is, the standard's been around forever. I know from speaking to some other guests, they're still bearish on this just because it seems like not everyone is willing to adopt that standard. But once you get used to it at Tesla, you realize this is the way it has to be.
Yeah, and that's fair. There are already, unfortunately, different standards of plug and charge. And then, so that's fair. Like, yeah, I don't care whatever standard, just pick one. But that to me is clearly just what it should be, and it's just a better charging standard. And I mean, it's kind of what most people, like with most level 2s, they just plug in and they work. And yeah, I've got a lot of bad charging experiences with level 2s that require an app and all this stuff. And you're like, what? And then they charge you like 50 cents a kilowatt hour. And like, it's a 6 kilowatt level 2 charger. Why are you charging? And why did I have to download like 3 different apps to make this thing work? But
taking a bird's eye view here from your experiences and everything else, and you being the sort of what I consider a pioneer in this field, any advice you'd give right now to anyone listening that's part of the EV curious crowd?
Curious. Yeah, that's a great question. Because I feel like here's a funny kind of anecdote for a lot of reasons, but like from an engineering perspective, I'm not the biggest fan of plug-in hybrids. Like I kind of mentioned, I have a internal combustion engine. I kind of prefer one or the other, but both my mom and mother-in-law both got plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. What's funny is they got them after both of their husbands had EVs. And so they're the only people I know with plug-in electric vehicles that actually plug them in. because they had to pay the money to install the infrastructure. They both had partners at Tesla, so they know just plug it in and it works. And then what's been funny is they've been so disappointed with the charging quality of these plug-in hybrid electric vehicles that there's been some, like, I wouldn't say buyer's remorse, because they're like, one got a Mercedes thing and one got a Volvo. They're happy 99.9% of the time. But as far as like the actual electric component of it, they're like, oh, that's weird. That's why doesn't it charge as fast as the Tesla does on a level 2? And so there's all these weird things. And so my thing to people who are kind of like curious is like, oh, usually they go, oh, I'll just get a plug-in hybrid. And so I share this anecdote to just say, like, the only people that use them are people that have already paid the money or figured out the infrastructure to charge an electric vehicle, so then they can charge a plug-in hybrid at home. Otherwise, no one charges a plug-in hybrid, except for like maybe that one rare time you need to use one at a hotel and you go to put your EV there and it's a plug-in hybrid charging, which that's a whole nother topic. But so my advice would be just hop in if you can afford it. And if you're not really tech averse, I think it's a pretty low bar. My thing is like, okay, if you're curious, do you want to learn a lot or do you want it to work? If you want it to work, where you consistently park your car overnight or at work, is there something you can plug it into, even a wall outlet? No? Okay, well, there's going to be a little more homework you have to do. Do you want to do that? And a lot of the time, most people say yes, and they're kind of curious. There's always like, I kind of even ask them, because like, why are you buying it? Are you buying it for the environment? Are you buying it because it's less maintenance? So this is probably a really bad answer. But I just find you usually just have to kind of ask them and like take one or two steps to figure out why they're interested in getting an EV. And I think it's cool. You're seeing a lot more people that are even saying like, I'm not buying it for environmental. I just like the fact that it's low maintenance, or I like that it's just a new technology. That's interesting to me. And so it really has to meet where people are at. But I think for people who are EV curious, by far the best thing you can do is just go drive one. Go to a Tesla dealership, go to a dealership. I just kind of figure out what kind of car you want. Do you want a crossover? And then just go to a dealership, go to where, and just drive them. And pretty quickly, that'll kind of tell you what kind of experience you want. Some people get Teslas like, why aren't there any buttons? I don't want to deal with that. Totally get that. Other people are like, this thing, the seat's uncomfortable, yada, yada, yada. And this is where I just like, but people, the instant they start driving them, they realize, oh, this is still a car. And kind of figuring out the fears that sometimes, or the concerns these EV curious people have, I find are just like, they're concerned about being able to charge it overnight. And if they have access, or even at work, they have the ability to do that. Like, okay, that's a big box just checked off right there. Then just go drive one that you find, maybe do a little research, but just as long as you know what type of vehicle. And I think that's what's also so cool is up until a few years ago, it was either you could get a sedan, or you could get a bigger sedan, or you could get maybe a kind of crossover. And now it's pretty much every part of
the third row SUV was a big
That's true.
box to check.
That's
and
true.
That was what the EV9 did for us. That's something that we required. And the Rivian was just a little out of our price range. And now you got the EV9. Hyundai's coming out with their version as well real soon. There's a lot of others that are working their way into the system. And that's I think that's another big component of the adoption here is getting the right car for the right mission. And
for sure. And I would love to see more EV9 competitors for exactly that. That's such a popular segment, understandably, for the market, that there are a couple. Cadillac just came out with one, and they make Rivians look cheap.
They're insane.
Right, yeah. Exactly. And so, I think more competition kind of with the EV9 at its price point, which I think is just such a great starting point for that vehicle. One of the things that have been like talked about in the EV community for a long time is like getting butts in seats of electric vehicles. That's what sells them. And I think a few years ago, a lot of those people started changing their mind. Like, oh, we got just to this point, we got so many electric vehicles out there now. People can find them. Now we need to work on the charging, or we need to work on something else. And it's like, yeah, we probably need to work on that. But I am still finding that the best way for people to buy electric vehicles and experience them is just butts and seats. And a lot of the time it's just realizing, oh, this really isn't that different. It's just how I plug it at home or plug it in at home. And that's usually what kind of gets, and then people are like, so I don't have to do an oil change with this? And it just, that's when you start seeing so many of the gears turning in people's minds that like, oh, not only could this work with my like daily life, it'd actually be an improvement, or XYZ reason that they think, or the performance they like of it compared to the Subaru or whatever they're coming from.
Well, I think, you'd mentioned something about your wife with the new Model 3, how you used the term calming when she went for a ride in it. And I think that's a big part of that EV experience, which kind of really shocks people. I know the same thing with my wife as well. The power delivery is so linear and there's a lot of it, and the silence in the cabin, obviously the technology there as well. But you put that all together, and it is a different experience than driving your ICE vehicle, and it is a better one. It's superior. And if nothing else, that intangible there of getting that butt in the seat, all this other stuff is ancillary. But once you've fallen in love with that experience, then suddenly maybe you're willing to make compromises or just do your homework to figure out the most efficient way to drive this vehicle. And I think that's a big determining factor for adoption.
For sure.
Okay, we're coming up on time right now. This is your last chance here to give us some predictions as the next big innovations in EV charging and grid technology.
That's always dangerous. You know what I would love to see, though, is I think, honestly, it's pretty simple. There's two things. The simple one is just see EV fast charging continue at the pace that it's been going at. I think it'll do that. The second part would actually be the opposite side of that, which is the battery technology, because we are seeing some pretty awesome stuff coming out of China for like charge curve and charge rate. And so I'd love to see more of that come to the US. I think it will eventually, and I'll be the first to admit, I think China, there has definitely been some marketing. For a while, there had been some marketing kind of fudging of the numbers, and admittedly, all EV battery and like EV automakers kind of do this. But it's now gotten to the point that there's a pretty big delta. I think it's the Zeekr Golden Battery is what they call it or market it as. But it charges from, I think it's 10 to 80% in 10 minutes. And then it charges 0 to 100 in 22 minutes, which is crazy.
That's a big deal.
Yeah. And then I think it was, I can't remember if it was CATL or BYD just announced that they have a 10C charge rate battery or something, which I'm just like, that is insane. It's probably real, but that seems like too good to be true. And like even get into like a physics and like heat standpoint of it, where it's just like, you're putting a lot of power in that thing real quick. But that's what we need to see. And I think a lot of EV people who are pro EV are like, oh no, charge rate's good. And I'm like, yeah, it's come a long ways and it's pretty good. But we are now getting kind of to like looking at the people who are buying EVs, and we've kind of gone past the first adopters to the kind of the inquisitive, and now we have to get to the mainstream. And to be honest, the technology I think is going to advance a lot faster for batteries and EVs to charge faster than it is for minds to change to say, oh, you can accept charging from 0 to 80 in 45 minutes for your truck or something. And so that's like the last kind of technical hurdle. I think it's going to be solved anyway. And once again, it's either that or we need to start getting a lot more butts and seats and people start realizing, oh, that's not really that big of a thing day to day. But when you're a car dealership in the middle of Ohio or somewhere kind of more rural, they probably don't know anyone else that have EVs. And so if they're going to be the first one to do it, they kind of need that answer or that question solved.
All right. Wonderful. Chase, I really appreciate you being on the show here. This was a really fun conversation. So you've got your own podcast and you've got your own consultancy. Why don't you share with us how people can reach you and what Grid Connections is all about?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn, which, cool, right? The new consulting website should be live actually within 2 weeks. I actually don't know. I hired a guy to do it. I don't know what the URL is we're going to use for that. But for our podcast, if you just go to gridconnections.fm, that takes you to the main site where you can stream and listen to them. And then more realistically, you'll probably go there and then download an Apple Podcast or something. Yeah, I mean, over 90% of our listeners listen to Apple Podcasts on their mobile phone. That's how they listen to us. But we're on everything. We're on YouTube. We record the full video too, but vast majority of us of listeners listen to us on Apple Podcasts, and you just can get it by going to gridconnections.fm.
Well, that's a wrap for this episode of the Urban EV Podcast. A huge thank you to Chase Butler for sharing his insights and experience. And once again, be sure to follow him on his Grid Connections podcast. It's a great show, and I really highly recommend that you tune in. I do personally. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe to the Urban EV Podcast as well. And if you found this discussion helpful, share it with your friends, family, or anyone curious about making the switch to electric. The road to sustainability starts at the plug, and that's why we're here. So we will see you all next week on a new episode of the Urban EV Podcast.